humility and his commitment to public service. Actually, the whole Swalwell family has been committed, I think, to public service. His father, his brother, at least one of his brothers, a police officer. You know, Eric's father, also Eric Swalwell, was police chief in Algona, Iowa. And Eric experienced, I think, firsthand at a young age.
You can't minimize it, can
you? The issues of a small town politics. His father's experience, I think, was really Eric's exposure to a profile in courage, because his father followed the rule of law and refused to give in to an exception to the mayor and city council members in his town who expected to be granted a special privilege. And because Eric's father did the right thing, he ended up losing his job, which was kind of a vicious lesson in small town politics at the time. But that incident turned out to be a benefit to the people of Dublin and the 15th Congressional District, because the Swalwells moved to Dublin, settled there, and Dublin was a place where Eric graduated in 1999 from Dublin High School. He went on to earn his undergraduate degree at the University of Maryland, College Park, where, no surprise, he majored in government and politics, graduated in 2003. He went on to earn his law degree in 2006. And if you know Eric, he's very proud to be a Terrapin. And when not talking about politics, he'd be happy to discuss Maryland basketball. When he was an undergraduate at Maryland, Eric interned for Ellen Tauscher in Washington, D.C. And as you might remember, the September 11 terrorist attacks occurred during that time, during his internship. The attacks inspired his first legislative achievement, where, using his student government association position at Maryland, he created a public-private college scholarship program for students who lost parents in the 9/11 attacks. After graduating from law school, Eric returned to the Bay Area and went on to serve as prosecutor in the Alameda DA's office. He would go on to serve in the Dublin as a participant in the Dublin Planning Commission as a commissioner before winning election to the Dublin City Council in 2010. And Eric was elected to represent the 15th Congressional District in 2012. By the end of his first term, Eric had gotten 3 bills through the House and 2 of them signed into law, which was more than any other freshman congressman. And during his 3rd term, Eric was appointed to serve on the highly important Judiciary Committee. And for the rest, I'm going to have Brody take over.
So in addition to the Judiciary Committee, some of the other committees Congressman Swalwell serves on are the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He is the top Democrat on the subcommittee on the CIA. He's responsible for the oversight, policy, activities, and budget of the CIA. He also serves on the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, where he addresses climate change and advocates for renewable energy. Eric chairs the Future Forum, a group of 18 young Democrats, Democratic members of Congress, and their focus is on issues and opportunities for millennials, such as including student loan debt and home ownership. And I'd like to tell you a story that happened about 3.5 years ago. It was right after Trump got elected in December 2016, and Eric had a town hall in Castro Valley. It was in a huge auditorium, and it was packed. There was standing room only, with people standing in the back, about 5 people deep. After his talk, Eric went into the audience with a microphone and asked for questions. And one woman stood up and she talked into the microphone and she said, "I am a white woman and I have white privilege. but the father of my 2 sons is Black. My sons were helping me look for something that rolled out of our car, under our car. And so they're looking under the car, and the police thought that was suspicious behavior, and they came over and talked to her kids. And she says, I ask you, Congressman Swalwell, what do you have to say about that? And Eric very loudly says, Black Lives Matter. And the whole audience rose to their feet and clapped for several minutes. It was a wonderful experience. We're all very proud of our congressman, and we're honored to have him speak at our meeting. Thank you, Congressman Swalwell, for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Brody and Richard, for that introduction. And thank you to the club and just longtime leaders of the club as well, Ellis and Sharon. Thanks for allowing me to join during this historic time in our country. I guess I want to start where I'm going to end, which is we're going to win. We are going to win this November. It's going to be a reckoning at the ballot box. Don't count me, and I don't think any of us should be in the worrying ward or bedwetting crowd. We have every reason to be confident. And as I told my colleagues, we have a weekly leadership meeting with Speaker Pelosi. I recently said, you better believe that when Republicans are meeting, they believe they're going to win too. And so we need to carry ourselves with the confidence that our values are in the right place and the American people are with us. And we can't fight the last war. This is not 2016. Donald Trump is the incumbent president. He does not have Secretary Clinton as a foil, is an undeserving foil for him. He certainly used that all the way through. He owns this economy. He owns his failure of leadership in a pandemic, and he owns the continued failure to bring our country together. So we will have a President Biden. It's my hope that it's a Vice President woman, person of color as well, and that we are going to have a big, big win in the Senate and keep the House. And we're going to have an era of reformation in the first couple months where we put back in place everything that this president has destroyed in our country, but also address the lingering issues that for too long have not been addressed as it relates to climate, as it relates to once and for all, healthcare for all, and of course, taking on racial injustice in this country. As it relates to the pandemic, thank you for continuing to show the discipline of sheltering in place and only going out to the grocery store and the doctor and essential services when you need to do so. You know, it's frustrating right now that we continue to see the cases in Alameda County go up, but Contra Costa County, which is also part of my district, the cases have been relatively in the 15 to 20 new cases a day. But of course, we are a mega region in the Bay Area, and so we're not opening as fast as we would like because we're still seeing spikes. But the best thing we can do, I believe, is to continue to attack the healthcare crisis with testing, free, universal, widespread, distributed testing, treatment, continuing to invest in proven treatments, and tracing, making sure that we trace back very deep any contact that an individual who tested positive has to understand who they were exposed to have those individuals isolate, get tested themselves, and reduce the community spread that can put us back into a healthcare and economic crisis. If we make healthcare the tip of the spear, we can solve and address the economic issues. If we do it the other way around, as many have proposed, if we make the economy the priority and healthcare takes the back seat, I'm afraid that may serve some short-term purposes, that may relieve some short-term pent-up anxiety, but it will contribute to long-term economic woes, and of course the numbers of COVID patients will only go up. And so if we continue to show discipline, help those who are unemployed by extending unemployment insurance, make sure we keep reloading the Paycheck Protection Plan for small businesses who truly need it with transparency so that we know how the money is being spent, and to pay our healthcare workers, our essential workers, hazard pay so that they truly receive what they are worthy of for taking care of us in our time of need. That's what we passed in the HEROES Act in the House of Representatives. That's what we need the Senate to take up so that we can address these issues. And of course, as you know, to make sure that state and local governments are reimbursed for what they have spent in this crisis. California, as you know, went from a $10+ billion surplus in January to, by April, we were at a near $30 billion deficit. So nearly a $40 billion swing that will get worse over the next coming months. And states should be reimbursed. And California, as you know, is a donor state. Finally, I want to talk before we go to questions about what's going on in this country around racial injustice. And thank you for telling that story earlier, Brody. You know, I worked as a prosecutor in Oakland. I was raised by a police officer who was a chief of police, and I have two brothers who work as police officers and have been out at the protests with the sheriff's department. And so I understand, you know, law enforcement's desire to keep order, and as they will tell you, to go home to their families at night. We want that. However, as Brody said, Black Lives Matter, and we have systemic racism in our law enforcement agencies across America. Systemic racism that reinforces that African Americans are dangerous and guilty. That is how too many approach this. And I'm not saying that all cops are bad cops, hardly. But I'm saying that we are finding with these police abuses that there are too many exceptions. And just saying, well, 99.9% of police are good people. We can't, you know, just cast one bad apple on all of them. We're seeing too many bad apples in too many places to do nothing. So I will be in Washington on Wednesday for a hearing with the Judiciary Committee, where we will be voting on the George Floyd Act. We're going to name it the George Floyd Act, which will put in place police reforms that ban the chokehold, ban racial profiling, that require every agency to have a body camera, that also make sure that we have a national police officer misconduct database so officers can't go state to state if they do engage in bad conduct, that we get rid of qualified immunity so police officers don't believe that they can't be personally held liable. And when it comes to prosecuting civil rights cases on the criminal side, we will lower the standard from willfully, that the officer has to act willfully to be prosecuted, to recklessly, which I think more aligns with how we want officers to act. Now, all of that said, we have 226 co-sponsors in the House of Representatives, not a single Republican yet. I don't understand how they couldn't vote for this bill, but we will put them up to the test. We'll reserve judgment until the actual vote takes place. But we have to keep the pressure up so that it gets a vote as well in the Senate. And if it does not get a vote, again, this has to be a top of mind election issue, because we are seeing, this is not just something that's happening in our cities, that people in the suburbs and exurbs, sometimes majority white person-led marches are going to the streets to say Black Lives Matter. And they have to matter not just when it comes to policing, but how we invest in healthcare, jobs, childcare, and of course, education. So I will continue to work on those issues, but I'm excited about what the next 140 some odd days hold for us, because I feel the wind at our back. And I will also just leave you with this. My effort this election cycle is called Remedy. I picked 10 seats, 6 in the House, 4 in the Senate, where if we win, it's the remedy and it puts us in the majority. And so I'm going to be asking you, just as you helped us during the 2018 cycle to win the House, please help me make the remedy for 2020 by sending text messages, writing postcards, and making phone calls into some of these states. And the 3 states right now that we're looking at on the Senate to flip are Alaska, South Carolina, and Iowa, and then holding Alabama, where Doug Jones is being challenged. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Brody. And yes, Brody, thank you for plugging Endgame. It is a tribute, and it is dedicated, when you read the dedication at the end of the book, first and foremost to my constituents who have given me hope to believe that this country is still one worth fighting for and redeeming. So thank you, and I'll turn it back to you for questions.
Well, Eric, why don't you tell us a little bit about the book? Give us a little.
Yeah. So Brody, in some ways it's a children's book because the only way I was able to write it was at the end of some of the longer, harder days, or after long weeks of interviews, when I was able to see my daughter, who was 1 at the time, and put her down to bed, I would, instead of reading her a storybook or singing her a song, I would just recount to her with a dictation app on my phone what had happened. And so in a sing-song voice, I would say, "So Cricket, Mr. Schiff told Mr. Meadows, please sit down, Mr. Meadows. It's not your turn to speak, Mr. Meadows. You're out of order, Mr. Meadows." So I'm horrified that if the audio ever got out, it would sound like a children's book. But that's what helped me take my notes every day and write the book. But it really is a call to action that if we stand up to this president as a bully, we will find that he backs down. And even though we did not remove him from office, because we stood up to him, Ukraine actually ended up getting the aid in the end. And I think we exposed so many of the tactics that he uses in his corrupt schemes that the lesson has to be, until Election Day, keep standing up to him.
Thank you. Richard, I think you have some questions for Eric.
Yeah, the first question that I have for Eric is, when you started in Congress, you joined across the aisle and tried to establish a dialogue. Do you ever speak with any of the across the aisle members about how they feel about the current administration or even current government?
I do, Richard. And what's frustrating is that a lot of my friendships have been frayed over the last 3 years since Donald Trump was elected. And so I built partnerships, passed bipartisan legislation, but after the Russia investigation, what I found was so many people would say to me privately on the Republican side, "Look, I don't like what he's doing. Russia's not our friend, but when he tweets at you, he wins." And that was so frustrating, because what they were saying was they were putting their own job ahead of standing up to the president. And they were worried that they would lose in a primary instead of standing up to him. So yes, of course, I'm friendly with some of them. I talk with some of them, but I am looking forward to a reset, and I will reach out in a sincere way in 2021 with any Republicans who want to work with us. But I think right now we just have to beat them, because that's the only way to make a difference right now. They're, other than Mitt Romney, who showed the courage to vote for removal, there is almost no one in the Congress, both chambers, on the Republican side who is willing to stand up to the president. And so I can be friendly, but these are people I work with. They're not necessarily friends. And I think until we see that reckoning this November, we just have to win.
I understand. I have a second question. It's a little bit away from the topics we've been discussing so far today, but child psychological abuse is not properly defined in the law. Would you sponsor an amendment to public law to properly define child psychological abuse and to require professionals to report it when suspected?
Richard, I'd love to learn more about that. Some of the hardest cases I worked on as a prosecutor involved children and the abuse they were subjected to, and communicating with children because many times the child is the only witness to the abuse, and it's very difficult to have a child convey what has happened to them. And so I think having more social workers and experts in the field as well is needed. But yes, I would love to learn more about this issue and have a see something, say something, do something mindset if it is occurring.
Yeah, we'll send more information. We have a member of our club who's especially interested. Okay. Brody?
I have a question. It's from Ellis Goldberg. He says, why not impeach again for misuse of the military?
Yep, Ellis, I believe we should be impeaching the Attorney General. By the way, just to back up, I had supported that in addition to impeaching President Trump. I believe he was impeachment worthy when he lied to Congress before the Mueller report came out. I think what he did with the Mueller report makes him impeachment worthy. And I think what he's doing right now is at least investigative worthy. Now with the president, look, he's impeached forever. And I believe we not only impeached him, I learned, during the experience that the effect of getting the money to Ukraine was also worth it, that it took an impeachment investigation. But I will just say right now, I believe, as I said, this election is going to be here before we know it. Our focus, I think, should conduct aggressive oversight, try and keep an ankle monitor and, as much, restraints on the president as possible, and just mobilize people so we win at the ballot box. And it's unfair, but what we're up against in November is just winning by one vote is not going to be enough. It cannot be close. It has to be indisputable, because you may have, and I don't say this in jest, and I hate that I have to say it at all, but we may be in a situation where you may have a military officer or a Secret Service agent who will have to be asked to get the guy out of the house because he doesn't live there anymore. And we don't want it to be close, because if it's close, it goes to the courts. And we don't know what the courts will do. We saw 3 justices today say that they believe employers should be able to fire their employees because they're of the LGBTQ community. So that's what we're up against in the courts. So I really believe it's not fair, but we want the result to be overwhelming and so obvious that if the president refuses to leave, which some fear, and I do, that he will, that it's easy for people to pull him out.
Here's a question. It's about the Lincoln Project. And I'm not sure if I understand it. It says, none in Congress, but powerful Republicans. How can they help in November?
So the Lincoln Project was conceived by Rick Wilson. I don't know if anyone follows him on Twitter. He has a great Twitter account. He was a Republican consultant. George Conway, John Weaver, who was John McCain's campaign manager, and a bunch of other, Bill Kristol, conservative columnist. And we may not ever align with these folks again, but I think it's a recognition that we all believe in this country. We all believe in the rule of law, the independence of prosecutors, the freedom of press, and that if that means working with folks who we may not agree with on other issues, so be it. Saving this country has to come first. And so I actually have spoken with those folks and some of their supporters about how we can cross support efforts to continue to expose the president for who he is, and most importantly, mobilize people to the polls. Most polling shows that if we beat Donald Trump, and when we beat Donald Trump, it's going to be because Republican women crossed over. Republican women who could not bring themselves to vote for Secretary Clinton in 2016. Some voted for Donald Trump and held their nose. Some just didn't vote at all. But they are the ones who showed up in some of the midterm states that we won in Iowa, Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, where we flipped seats. And so if we can continue to have voices like the Lincoln Project communicating to them, that's where I think we really have a great shot. And then on our end, turning out the 5 million people who voted for Barack Obama in 2012, but did not vote in 2016. And so that's why I think, Vice President Biden needs to still extol, what his progressive values are. And that coalition stitched together will be the Biden majority in November.
Okay. I have another question. It says, sort of personal. If my college-age daughter wants to take the semester off and move to a state to work on a dump Trump campaign for the summer and fall, which state should I send her to? I'm very concerned about, is this the same? I'm very concerned about voter suppression. Oh, that's a different question. So yeah, what state would you send her to?
I would say Alaska, because we can win in Alaska. Our candidate is Dr. Al Gross. He is a commercial fisherman and orthopedic surgeon. His father was the Attorney General of Alaska, and he is running as an independent who will caucus with the Democrats. He is running neck and neck in the most recent poll. It's even. He's been out fundraising the freshman Senator Dan Sullivan. And so that race is in reach, and he only needs about 150,000 votes to win there. which is just about what I would get in a congressional race. That gives you a sense of, the size of Alaska. It is one congressional district for the whole state. So doing that, I think, one, it's a beautiful part of the country. Two, it's one of the safer parts because it is rural and the risk for COVID is not as high. And three, and most importantly, aside from safety, three, you can really run an effective field campaign there because, again, you're only talking about a field of 150,000 voters. So if she's interested, happy to connect her to that campaign. And when it's safe to go to Alaska, reach out. And we could actually, I would pledge to support in some way her to do that through our campaign because we're trying to use our resources to support efforts just like that for people to be able to go out and do that.
Okay. We're all very concerned about voter suppression.
Yeah.
What is happening in Washington to remedy this problem?
So I think the remedy is, and I'm concerned too, but I think the remedy is a submarine mission, meaning that most of this fight has to be fought under the surface. In the courts, of course, just county to county and each registrar's office putting pressure on accessibility and keeping the voter rolls from being purged, making sure that felons are able to vote where the states allow it. But above the surface, the risk is that if we are talking about it publicly, if we're running television ads about voter suppression, or if lawmakers are going on television and saying that the vote is not going to be counted, that actually has the effect of suppressing the vote. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Say you have a single mom in Georgia, a swing state, and she has to pick up her little girls after work and has maybe 30 minutes in that crammed window of getting them fed, getting them bathed, getting them to bed to go to the polls. If she sees that all the Democrats are saying is that the outcome is going to be rigged, your vote may not count, the lines are going to be too long, she may not show up. And that's the last thing we want, is that she would not show up. And so we want to make sure that below the surface, we're in the courts, we're at the county registrar's office. Above the surface, we're motivating that single mom on the issues to show up and make sure that her voice and her vote cannot be denied.
Brody, I see a question from Susan Fior, who I haven't seen for a while, so I'm glad to see you here. What impact could the many, I think you mean judicial appointments, approved in the last 3.5 years have on future Democratic administrations?
They better help us elect more Democratic administrations, because we recognize we have a deficit and we're really far behind. And so, if you think back to, and I think it was, I want to credit the right person here. I believe it was David Axelrod had pointed out a couple of years ago that at the Democratic National Convention in 2016, none of our nightly speakers in their live primetime addresses brought up the Supreme Court. In the Republican convention, every single one of their primetime speakers brought up the Supreme Court. And we just have not, I think, messaged to the public how important it is that we have a Supreme Court that says my body, my choice, that says, of course, that love is love, that believes in the Voting Rights Act, which was gutted in 2014. And so we need that in the Supreme Court. But the best way to do that is to motivate young people to understand that these issues are at stake. And for young people, they, I think, sometimes can believe that the gear shift only has one direction, forward. But as we saw today, we were on very thin ice, and even having the concept that employers can't fire, a gay employee, that got 3 votes that said that they could. So they were only 2 away from that being the law of the land. And so we have to continue to communicate that to young people who I don't think are connecting those dots as much as we need them to.
Rick, do you have other questions? I have one as well.
I had a question about kind of a bigger umbrella about the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, we talk about police and so on, but really the economic opportunities, ability to join a union and maybe have some more job security. Investing in the public sector seem to be other things that are part of that whole struggle to bring members of our Black population and people of color to where they need to be in the society. So, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, invest in their communities. And when I ran for president, Richard, what I found was that in so many cities like Chicago and Baltimore and Philly and Houston and Oakland, very close to us, that I would see on different blocks in Black communities, payday lenders, liquor stores, crumbling schools, and I wouldn't see investments in, they were food deserts. There were not grocery stores. There were not good paying jobs. The schools were not going to prepare the next generation. And because of childcare, lack of access to childcare or, paid childcare or pre-K programs, you would just see, cyclical poverty and a lack of hope as well, which I think you can connect to gun violence. As one person in the community told me, violence is the lowest form of communication. And if, people are not invested in, they don't have hope, they don't, have schools that can educate them or retention of teachers, you can see why, there's higher incidence of gun violence in some of these cities. And so I do believe that, reprioritizing how we budget our communities to budget for these priorities is also needed. It can't just be police reform because so much more is needed.
There was a question from, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Rick.
Well, there was a question I see from our friend Brian Lauver, and says how plane rides, I guess, how safe do you feel plane rides are since you fly more than most of us? Have things changed to make plane rides safer that maybe we'll start to get people traveling again?
Well, it's a great question. And I flew home last week. I'll fly home next week. And I have to be honest, I'm concerned that some airlines are, they're filling up the plane. United, for example, has about 10 flights a day between San Francisco and Washington. It's been reduced to just 2. And so they're not flying empty planes anymore. They're packing people in. They're filling the middle seats. I did lead an effort about a month and a half ago with the Flight Attendants Union to try and publicly pressure the airlines to require masks on planes. That was not required, about 45, 60 days ago. And so, I was I sent a letter to the FAA and also made public calls to do that. And thankfully that is the case. And we know now that, if people are wearing masks, they significantly reduce the spread if they're carrying it themselves. I'm also concerned at the airports, again, not to go too far into the weeds here, but what I've noticed at the airports is that although you've seen about a 90% reduction in air travel among Americans, instead of spreading out the travel among the dozens of gates that most airports have, they've put all the flights that they have for that day in like one section. And so even before you get on the plane, you're crowded around. And I've seen this not just in San Francisco, but also in Washington. You've got 4 or 5 gates just packed with people. And you would think that with an airport that has 90% fewer people in air traffic, the best thing you could do is to spread out where the gates are. But instead, they've kind of just consolidated all of them. So my best advice is that, unless you have to fly, don't. It's an awful experience. Nothing is open at the airport. There's no food or beverage service on the planes, and they keep the seatbelt light on the whole time to discourage people from moving around. I also work, though, to allow Congress to work virtually so that any of my colleagues that are either COVID positive or have family members or themselves have pre-existing conditions could meet remotely for a committee hearing or vote remotely. And that was something I had pushed in 2013 for us to be able to do that in an emergency. And thankfully, about 2 months ago, we passed that. And this Wednesday's hearing will be a virtual hearing for the Police Reform Act. Now, I'll go to Washington. I have not had, knock on wood, any symptoms and have not been around anyone. But there are colleagues. One of our colleagues is in isolation right now because of a family member who tested positive, and she certainly should not be around us, but she still wants to participate in the hearing. And thankfully, Congress has embraced some of these technologies.
Were you there live for George Floyd's brother last week? And were other members, was it a full house, or did some of them do it remotely?
I was there, and we took the biggest room that we had and had the members, most of the members sit in the audience seating, and then just a few members sit at the dais, and you would rotate when it was your turn. It was very powerful to listen to Felonious Floyd, George Floyd's brother. It was hard. It was hard for me. I can't imagine how hard it was for him. One frustrating aspect of all of this is that the Republicans are refusing to wear masks in these public settings, despite the head physician saying that everyone in the Capitol has to wear a mask. They refuse to do so, which is also on the Democratic side. A lot of my colleagues just don't want to come in person. And so what the Republicans do is they refuse to wear masks. Then a lot of my colleagues are like, I can't risk it because people aren't wearing masks and being in person. And then when members on our side meet virtually, the Republicans all show up not wearing masks physically, and then they beat us up over the head and say, see, you guys don't even want to be here in person, the people need us working, and you guys are just abdicating that responsibility. So that is quite frustrating. Now, just today, one of my Republican colleagues who a couple of weeks ago when we met refused to wear a mask and was interviewed by a CNN reporter, said that he doesn't need to wear a mask because he's staying 6 feet away from people. He tested positive, which if he's around a bunch of people who aren't wearing masks, just like him, that's what's going to happen. But that I'm sharing a lot just of the day to day, but that's what we're experiencing.
Tell us if there's anything happening with the Green New Deal.
Yeah, I see an opportunity, Brody, once we go from relief to recovery, that we can put in place and use recovery from COVID is a way to create clean, green jobs, and to do that in a way that we've never done before, because we know that through carbon capture, carbon reuse, carbon sequestration, that there's more money to be made in solving the problem of climate than deepening and making it worse. And I know on our side, there's a real desire to have a transportation and infrastructure COVID stimulus package that would invest in green technologies. And I also hope, and there's going to be pressure on a President Biden to have a Paris-like summit, hopefully in the United States, and to get us back into that agreement within the first 100 days of his administration.
Rick, do you have a question? If not, I have one.
Well, there was one question. I think it's a little more political as we look forward to the convention, which unfortunately I'm going to be a Biden delegate there. I'm not sure the nature of the convention, if it's going to be scaled down. I imagine it will be in Milwaukee. The question has to do with what have you seen, maybe heard from Bernie supporters as far as getting behind Biden so that we can get rid of this man in the White House. Have you overheard any dialogue or been directly involved in any dialogue from Bernie supporters?
Yes, of course I have at the local level, and I think locally folks understand, the urgency to beat Donald Trump, but also that Vice President Biden needs to bring, onto his team progressive voices, and the more that he can demonstrate that, the better, I think, result he's going to get. And more importantly, once he's president, he's going to need buy-in from, progressives in the House and in the Senate. And I think look, Vice President Biden is not shy. He has the gift of gab. I have had dinner with him, and it went 2 hours over the 1 hour that I had budgeted for the dinner. He's a very good listener. He's also a very good talker, in a very genial, sincere way. And so what I like about that is I think he can continue to reach out to, Sanders supporters, just be himself, listen, and then in deeds show that, he is willing to embrace, a progressive agenda, especially when it comes to healthcare and climate and student loan debt, as the Sanders campaign and the Warren campaigns were talking about in the primary.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I have, Brody.
Who do you like, Eric, for Joe Biden's VP pick?
I would say, if I had a top three, it would be Senator Harris, Senator Duckworth, or Val Demings, my judiciary colleague. Val's the real deal. She can really speak about police reform with the credibility of being a police officer, a police chief. She rides a Harley, but she's been, if you read anything she's written in the last couple months, she's really been critical of the police, and I think has called for reforms that will have more weight because she has credibility in the law enforcement community, but also is a progressive champion on those issues. So I think any of those three would be great. They meet the standard of being qualified to be president, if God forbid that happened during the first term. And more importantly, I think they could work with the vice president and carry the values that people in our club care about.
Here's a question from one of our younger members. He says, I feel passionate that we need a comprehensive rezoning in this district, and I'm not sure what he means, to reimagine construction for eco, transit, and pedestrian-friendly development.
I can tell you that as a former planning commissioner and city council member, and I know Sabina, who's on this call, deals with issues like this all the time. The priority has to be a transit-oriented development. And that's why I think in future infrastructure legislation, particularly in a Democratic majority in the House and Senate and White House, we have a real opportunity to make sure that federal dollars are tied to projects that put transportation and housing together. That, of course, would reduce emissions, reduce the need for people to drive cars. My priority at home, by the way, when it comes to transportation, is to extend from the Dublin Pleasanton station 50 miles over the Altamont with Valley Link, which would be a clean rail project that would go 6 different stops over the Altamont and take 30,000 cars off the road. But the hope is that at each stop you have housing and transportation interconnected.
I have a question about, there's a movement, Black Lives Matter has, defund the police, which really means decreasing the amount of money the police get, and so that some money can go to social services, so you can have like unarmed professionals go in into these crises interventions, or for mental illness crisis, or the homeless. How do you see that? As it's not really defunding the police, but shifting it so that, because policemen are just, they have to deal with criminals, and they're really geared to, for violence. And so maybe you need some unarmed professionals to deal with mental health crises. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
I do believe, Brody, that, community by community should look at, how they are prioritizing their resources. And in some communities, you see that the police, you have police with militarized, vehicles. They have, some forces that look like the Avengers, and then doctors and nurses are wearing garbage bags to address COVID. And so I do believe that community by community, we should look at how we're investing in social services, how we're investing, as I said, in schools. New York City, for example, has a police budget of $6 billion. And that is a big budget. That's a lot of money to spend. That's a lot of schoolhouses, to spend on a police force. And so defunding the police as I hear it from folks on the ground, is not getting rid of the police. It's reimagining how your taxpayer dollars are used. But I'll just say that the bill that we have, the George Floyd Act, there's no defunding at all in there. It's actually reforming the police and policing the police, fixing the police, and allowing locals to determine how they want their taxpayer dollars to be spent. But I do believe that whether it's defense spending, which I have consistently voted against, or even over militarizing some law enforcement agencies, that we should invest in our kids and invest in hope, but still make sure that you have law enforcement that can show up in emergencies, in violent situations. And I think we can do all of that without having false choices.
Okay. Richard, do you have any other questions?
No, that's it. Is that Nelson making his opinion known back there?
Oh my God, he makes for an awful legislative aide. And he probably thinks that I make for an awful line and order cook, because he's constantly eating. But yes, it's actually been a real joy to see the kids as much as I've been able. Frankly, working to win the majority in 2018 and running for president, I was not a great father. I was not a great husband. I was not around as much as I would have liked to have been. And it's awful that we're all going through this pandemic, but I think, for some families that are on the road a lot, it is a blessing to see the kids as much as I've been able
Absolutely.
To see them.
Does everyone know how to go to the chat feature and ask a question if you have one?
And I will, Brody, let me just put in the chat feature in case anyone has if you have a constituent issue or something you want to just talk to me privately about, you can email me. I just put my email in the chat feature. Obviously, most of our work right now is around just COVID. We can do other non-COVID work on my official side, but I want to make sure that unemployed are receiving their benefits, that small businesses are able to get their loans, and if you're a healthcare worker, that we understand the needs on the ground. So yeah, don't hesitate to reach out if we can help in any way.
What do you think is the likelihood of the Republicans and the Democrats getting together and coming together on the HEROES Act to get something passed?
Frankly, unlikely, but our best allies are Republican governors, because they're the ones who've had their budgets just eviscerated, as well as Democratic governors. But Republican governors and the president's Republican appointed Fed chair, Jerome Powell, have all said that the need is there. And so if we keep the pressure on from Republican governors who are going to feel the pain as much as we are, I think that's our best shot. Now, Mr. McConnell started off by saying states should go bankrupt. Of course, he's in a state that's a taker state or a donor state. It's easy for them to say. And now he's saying, well, if businesses are allowed to have absolute immunity from COVID litigation, and we suspend the payroll deduction tax, he would be interested in negotiating. Speaker Pelosi has said everything's on the table. I'm hesitant, and I think she would be too, to completely waive businesses' liability and not incentivize them to make sure that their businesses for their own employees and the public are safe. But we, at this point, would welcome any conversation that can make sure we don't have to have massive layoff of teachers, firefighters, nurses, doctors, the people who have gotten us through this pandemic.
Here's a new question that came up. Does Amy McGrath have any chance of successfully challenging Mitch McConnell?
She does, and there's another candidate, I think his last name's Booker,
Right.
Who also equally has a shot. Now, we need 4 seats to win the majority in the Senate. It could be 5 if Doug Jones loses. So just kind of going west to east, this is how I see it. We have a shot in Alaska. I just laid that out for you. Dr. Al Gross running against Dan Sullivan. Arizona, Colorado, we're not only do we have a shot, we're ahead in the polling, we're ahead in the money with Mark Kelly and John Hickenlooper. Montana, we have Steve Bullock has a 75% approval rating as governor right now, running against the freshman Senator Steve Daines. In Iowa, Teresa Greenfield is polling ahead, P-O-L-L-I-N-G, polling ahead of Joni Ernst. In North Carolina and in Georgia, same thing. We are seeing terrific candidates step up who are raising money and polling quite well. And so you look at South Carolina, Texas, and Kentucky, those are races where with enough money and enough registering and mobilizing of voters, I do think we have a shot. And that's where I don't know if we're going to have 60 seats, a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, but I think we're going to win more than just the 4 that we need. And I would put Kentucky in play. By the way, all of that being said, we should get rid of the filibuster when we win the majority. There's no reason to keep that in place at all, especially with Mitch McConnell and the way that they've used it for so long, only when it is to their convenience.
Okay. Is there any more questions? I don't see any here. Rick, do you have any?
No, I don't see any more questions on my end here that I'm looking at.
Okay. Well, that might be it.
Well, thank you guys again for all you're doing as a club. And I really would welcome and appreciate the help when it comes to these 10 candidates. And I'll make sure our team, sends to you how you can do that, because hopefully we can all convene in our IBEW space that we've rented and work out of there soon. But before that, we do have ways virtually to support those candidates, and I would really welcome that. So Rick, Brody, thank you all for having me on and listening and putting up with the kids. You got a picture of what I am working through.
That's life.
All day long. Yeah, but thank you again. Be well and be blue, because it's going to be a big, big November.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eric.
Thank
Of
you.
course. Thank you, guys.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Brody. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
Great job.
Unmuted.
Bye, Brody. Thank you all.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming.
Okay.
I'll just push over here.
I lost the cursor.
Hey, Brody, are you able to share his email with us? Because it didn't come through.
Oh,
when-
yes, yes. That's why I was waiting here. Let's
Thank
see.
you. This is Nancy Dates.
I'm looking for it.
Hey, Brody, can you hear me?
Yes, but let me see. I'm trying to find Eric. Richard, can you see it? Okay, I'm having a hard time finding it, but I'll look. Here it is. Okay. Okay, does everyone see his? I'm trying to unmute everybody here.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for coming. Okay, thank you.